So, Module 2, we are looking at the world of women in Homer. And we've got to bear in mind when we're thinking about this that we need to look at the historical context quite carefully. We already talked about the fact that these are probably male-authored within a context, a social context that is operated by men. But we also have to think about the fact that these are in a different literary context. So the transmission history of the texts, where they were probably originally sung by bards in a feast context, and then they were transmitted orally over many generations, and then probably around 750 BC. There's some controversy around that date, but written down around then. And so you've got to bear in mind that there is this long kind of history and transmission of these texts that is kind of changing over time. So when we're thinking about the kind of context of women, we're not just thinking about the context of when it was written in the 8th century, although that does play a part. We're also thinking about the context of the time that it's imagining back to, the time when these songs perhaps were first sung, around, say, the 13th century BC. So we've got quite a wide historical period that we're going to be thinking about here, but I think that is interesting in thinking about kind of the ways that the roles of women are delineated. So how are women talked about in this different world, this different historical context, and this different language? Because we also have to bear in mind that the Homeric epics were originally written in ancient Greek. And so I wanted to begin by thinking about the very words that are used for women in Homer. So we've got several different words for women or for girls at different stages in their life. So we've got parthenos, which is a virgin or an unmarried woman. We then move to korē, which means a sort of girl or a bride or maybe even a young wife. We have gunē, which is the standard word for woman, but it also means wife, and that's important. We'll get back to that. And then we've got mater, which means mother, and then several other words which mean wife. So pretty typically, as we can see from this vocabulary, a woman's world revolved around marriage. Marriage most of all. The word for her when she's a young girl is that she's a virgin, not yet married. The word for her when she's a woman is also a wife. Both of those words mean the same thing. And so for a woman to be a wife was paradigmatic to her identity. There's also the other aspect of womanhood in antiquity, which is childbirth. And so we mentioned the word for mother, mater, and motherhood is really defining of a woman's experience. And there's an image that we get of this kind of women's experience in book 22 of the Iliad. It's an incredibly important moment. It's the point where Hector and Achilles are racing around the walls of Troy, and it's leading up to that final duel where Hector is going to be killed. And they race past the washing troughs where the women used to wash, and there's this incredibly beautiful description. So nearby are the fine, wide troughs of stone where the wives and daughters of the Trojans once washed their gleaming clothes in peacetime before the Greeks came. Okay, so we've got this amazing moment where Hector and Achilles are fighting for their lives. They're fighting for ultimate glory. And what do we remember the women doing? They wash the clothes. Okay, so there's this contrast between these two worlds, the wartime and the peacetime, the men who fight for glory, the women who take care of the home. And we need to think about the fact, as I said, that this is a narrative that is very much being told by the men. So the men do have a kind of incentive to structure the world in that way. And for the men, women most of all are seen as objects of exchange. And there's a particular word for this in Greek, a geras, which means an object that is exchanged. And it is used as much for objects like cattle or tripods as it is for women. So, you know, that's obviously problematic for us looking at it back nowadays. This is especially true in war. So we get the example, obviously, of Chryseis and Briseis in the Iliad, who are being traded as objects of war. The reason Achilles gets angry that Briseis has taken from him is as much as the fact that he later claims that he cares for her, as that she brings him honour because she gives him status as being an object of war. So women are kind of very much conceptualised as objects, as possessions in this way. We have Helen, most of all, who's seen as a possession. So in book 3 of the Iliad, when we have the duel for Helen's hand, the argument around Helen is, well, you know, we're fighting for Helen and her possessions. And it's like the two things are equivalent. It's like Helen and her possessions, same thing. So Helen really is seen as something that you possess, that you own. But we also get Penelope, and this is in peacetime, back in Ithaca in the Odyssey. We have Penelope being fought over by the suitors, and they really want her, again, as much for her as they want her for the control that she will bring them over the household which they are depleting, right? The oikos, the household that includes not just the house, but the property, the slaves, the cattle, and Penelope brings all of that with her. So she is definitely being seen by the suitors who are fighting over her hand as a means towards property, towards objects, and she herself is that kind of an object. There's also a grim fate for women within war. We've seen women like Briseis and Chryseis who are taken as captives, as objects, as geras, as war prizes. And it's something that both men and women are very aware of, that women's status is incredibly contingent upon their men. And in Book 6 of the Iliad, when Hector is talking to Andromache, there is this incredibly moving passage where Hector looks ahead to what might happen if he dies. And he says, not even that sorrow moves me, as does the thought of your grief, Andromache, when some bronze-clad Greek drags you away weeping, robbing you of your freedom. So he is more moved by the idea that Andromache will be taken as a slave than he is by his own death. And this just demonstrates just how contingent women are on men. Andromache, in response to Hector, calls him her father, her mother, and her brother all at once. So she's lost everybody, and he is the sole person she depends on. We get examples of women being exchanged in this kind of a way in Book 9 of the Iliad, where Odysseus is trying to persuade Achilles to come back to the war. And it's not just Briseis, the one object who is being thrown into this, it's an entire package. So Odysseus describes Agamemnon's offer. He will give you 7 women of Lesbos, the work of whose hands is blameless, right? They can weave, that's good. Whom when you yourself captured strong-founded Lesbos, he chose, and who in their beauty surpassed the races of women. He will give you these, and with them shall go the one he took from you, the daughter of Briseis. So yes, we've got Briseis, but we've also got lots of women who can weave really well, they're really pretty, and they were captured in war. Okay, this gives you quite a good sense of that world that women are inhabiting at that point. Another key role of women is to give birth, and we've seen Andromache demonstrating her paradigmatic womanhood to Hector by bringing her son Astyanax out onto the walls of Troy. We also see Penelope with Telemachus, right? This is an older son who is now just on the cusp of manhood and is about to take over the palace of Ithaca. But you can see here that what they really want is women to give birth to a son. We don't have examples of women who have daughters being shown off. And in fact, Helen is the one example that we might think of as a woman with a daughter, Hermione, and she leaves her behind to go with Paris. So we have a kind of structure of values where women really need to give birth to sons because they're the heirs, right? So again, this kind of privileging of the male. And the importance behind this is seen in the example of Telemachus, who is very much presented as the heir to Odysseus. So we have this idea of Odysseus's line carrying on through Telemachus, and when Telemachus visits Pylos and Mycenae, we have him being recognised as, yes, you are clearly of the line of princes, you're of the line of kings. And so this line, this continuation of the male kind of heritage is incredibly important, and women play a role in that. And because of this, there is an anxiety that men have around women that because they kind of control the lineage and the heirs, the offsprings, there's an anxiety around women's mobility outside the house and a desire to control them and keep them within the house. And this is seen particularly in the Odyssey, where we have that really kind of problematic depiction of women like Circe, who, God forbid, turns men into pigs, operates by herself, takes no man as her master. We have these women who are operating outside the household and who are seen as kind of being transgressive in the way that Penelope, who is kept within the oikos, who is told to go upstairs by her son and kept within bounds. And so there's this real attempt to control women and make sure that they're not out of control, because that would lead to problems with male heritage and male paternity. So that's what the men say. What do the women say about themselves? And again, we have to bear in mind that this is not what the women are actually saying, this is what the male poet is saying through them. Well, we have these kinds of speech genres that women are expected to perform, and one of them is lament. This is pretty much the only public speech genre that a woman is allowed to do. And we see these laments cropping up again and again. We see Briseis lamenting, and it's the only time she actually speaks within the Iliad, but she's given a huge lament in Book 19 for Patroclus. We have Andromache's private lament in Book 6, where she laments for her family who were killed by Achilles. And then we have a series of public grief, where in Book 24 of the Iliad, we have the public laments of Helen, Andromache and Hecuba. So there's this real connection between women's speech and lamentation. But But as we've seen, we've also seen instances where women are silenced. And we have that moment where Telemachus tells Penelope to go upstairs, Hector tells Andromache to go inside. So yes, women are allowed to speak outside the house for public instances of lament, but they are also often told to be silent and to go inside. So for a woman, her world is very much circumscribed in the oikos, in the house. It's limited to marrying and giving birth. She is highly dependent on her husband. Women are seen as prizes, as objects, and the word there is geros, to be fought over, especially in war, but even in peace, for control of the oikos. Their control over birth means that there is a real fear about their agency, which means that their mobility in their speech then gets limited. And when they do speak, it's often in lament, which is one of the few public speech genres that women can allow, but it's one that is kind of around loss and what has been, rather than kind of them taking agency over their own speech. And this creates a strong contrast to the world of men, where we have men speaking very publicly, engaging in acts of war, getting glory, women, on the other hand, within the house. And so we have these moments, as I said, where we have the women's world focused. One of those key moments is book 18 of the Iliad with the shield of Achilles, where we have this world of peacetime and we have men and women, for example, dancing together. And so this very different world from the public world of men. In the Odyssey, we have the difference between that strange mythical world and the world of Ithaca delineated through the roles of women. So the women who are outside of the house, outside of control, Calypso, Circe and so on, versus Penelope who is within control. And that creates a very strong contrast between the first 12 books of the Odyssey, where you have this kind of other world, this strange mythical realm, and then the real historical world of Greece, where women are very much within the men's control. So that's the world of women. And in the next module, module 3, we're going to zoom in a little bit more specifically to look at one character, that's Helen, and we'll look at Helen first of all in the Iliad.